The first snows of October were a warning, a dusting of white lace over the dead brown grass. By November, the lace had become a woolen blanket, thick and suffocating. The people of Redemption, a town named for a hope it rarely delivered, felt the cold seep into their bones. It was a predatory cold, a living thing that stalked the narrow spaces beneath doors and through the chinks in log walls. This was not the familiar bite of winter, this was something ancient and mean. They said it was the worst freeze in 45 years, a figure passed down from the old ones who remembered the last time the river froze solid enough to hold a man's weight from bank to bank. Inside the town's small cabins, families huddled together, feeding their stoves a constant diet of precious cordwood, watching the heat flicker and die just a few feet from the iron belly. The air was thin and sharp, and every breath was a reminder of the body's fragility. Yet, as the town drew its circle of misery tighter, one man walked away from it. Abner was his name. A widower for 10 years, his children grown and gone to gentler climates, he was a solitary figure etched against the vast, unforgiving landscape. His ranch, once teeming with life, was now just a collection of quiet, drafty buildings surrendering to the elements. The town watched him. They saw him not at his ranch house, trying to patch the holes against the coming onslaught, but walking. Every morning, with a grim purpose that bordered on madness, he would walk toward the low, granite hills that formed the town's western boundary. He carried tools, a pick, a shovel, sometimes a bucket. He would disappear into the folds of the land, into a shadow that never seemed to lift, even at midday. "He's digging his own grave," muttered Finch, the man who ran the general store, as he watched Abner's silhouette shrink against the snow. Grief has finally taken him, the sentiment was shared. They saw a man broken by loss and solitude, performing a last, nonsensical ritual. They pitied him. They did not see what happened when he slipped through a narrow fissure in a rock face, a crack barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. They did not feel the immediate shift in the air, the subtle muting of the wind's eternal cry. They did not see the calm, methodical work being done in the deep quiet of the earth. Outside, the world was a symphony of suffering, the wind its conductor. Inside, there was only the rhythmic scrape of metal on stone, a sound of deliberate creation in a world bent on destruction. How was this possible? The question hung unasked in the frigid air, because no one believed there was anything to ask. They thought they knew the answer. They were wrong. The work had begun in the suffocating heat of late August. While the other ranchers worried over dried-up creek beds and the price of feed, Abner had looked to the sky, to the behavior of the birds, to the way the ants built their hills higher and with a frantic urgency. He felt a change in the deep rhythm of the seasons, a discordant note that promised a winter of unusual cruelty. He was a man who had spent a lifetime listening to the land, and it was now speaking to him of survival. His own house was a lost cause, a sieve of wood and crumbling daub that would devour firewood and offer little comfort in return. So he had turned his attention to the granite hills he had known since he was a boy, to a specific network of shallow caves he'd explored in his youth. They were not deep, just a series of interconnected chambers hollowed out by ancient water. To anyone else, they were just holes in the rock. To Abner, they were a vessel waiting to be filled with an idea. He spent the last warm weeks not in preparation, but in construction. He hauled flat, slate-like stones from a riverbed miles away, one painstaking trip at a time. He mixed clay and sand and horsehair into a stubborn, durable mortar. The townspeople saw his labor, of course. They saw him wrestling with stones, his old back bent to the task. Frank, a younger rancher whose property bordered Abner's, had stopped one day. Putting up a windbreak, Abner, he'd asked, his tone laced with a gentle condescension. Abner had just nodded, his face slick with sweat, offering no further explanation. "A man's got to keep busy," Frank said to his own horse, riding away and shaking his head. The old man was building his own tombstone. Inside the cave, the project took shape with a logic invisible to the outside world. He wasn't just walling off the entrance. He was creating a system. In the largest chamber, the one he designated for living, he laid a false floor, a perfectly level surface of those flat river stones, raised about a foot off the cavern's true bottom. He sealed the edges with his clay mortar, leaving a hollow space beneath. In an adjacent, lower chamber, he built a small, squat furnace from salvaged iron and phi clay, its design focused on a slow, controlled burn rather than a blazing fire. From this furnace, he constructed a flue, a long, winding channel of stone and mortar that snaked back and forth under the entire length of the raised floor before terminating in a narrow, almost invisible fissure high up on the cliff face. It was grueling, precise work, a puzzle of physics and patience. He was shaping the very path that he would take, coaxing it, directing it, ensuring not a single degree of warmth was wasted. He was not fighting the cold. He was preparing to harness the energy of his small fire, to make it do the work of a dozen. The first great blizzard of December arrived like an invading army, a wall of white that erased the world. In Redemption, the temperature plummeted to 20 below zero, and the wind drove snow into drifts that buried fences and blocked doors. The sound of it was a constant, shrieking torment. Inside his shelter, Abner heard it only as a distant, muffled roar, the anger of a beast locked outside his door. He lit a small fire in his furnace, using seasoned hardwood he had stacked in a dry side cavern. It was not a large fire, barely more than a handful of logs. But its purpose was not to radiate immediate, direct heat into the living space. Its purpose was to heat the air and smoke that would begin a slow journey through the serpentine flue beneath his feet. The science was simple, ancient, and utterly ignored by the world above. The hot gas, desperate to escape through the chimney high on the cliff, was forced to travel the long, winding path he had built for it. As it moved, it transferred its thermal energy into the mass of stone and earth that made up the floor and the flue walls. The stone, dense and patient, absorbed the heat slowly, steadily. After a few hours, the floor of the main chamber, cold to the touch at first, began to shed its subterranean chill. It did not become hot, merely not cold. A gentle, persistent, radiant warmth began to rise from the stones, warming the air, the walls, and Abner himself. There was no smoke in the chamber, the draft was perfect, pulling every wisp through the flue and out the distant vent. He had created a massive, low-temperature radiator out of the very ground he stood on. He kept a thermometer, a small, precious instrument he'd owned for 30 years, hanging from a peg. Outside, the world was a frozen hell. Inside his cave, the needle held firm at 55 degrees. It was not the oppressive, dry heat of a cabin stove, which scorches one side of you while the other freezes. It was an encompassing, uniform warmth, as if the earth itself were exhaling a gentle breath. He had food, smoked meats, dried beans, flour, coffee, enough for months. He had water from a slow, clean seep in the back of the cave system. He had his books and his tools. While the town of Redemption shivered and prayed for a reprieve, Abner sat in his stone chair, comfortable and calm, listening to the muted storm and the quiet, efficient work of his own hands. The greatest trick was its subtlety. There was no roaring fire to admire, only a profound and persistent absence of cold. The winter did not relent. It tightened its grip, week by week. The initial blizzard was followed by a period of brutal, windless cold, where the air itself seemed to crackle and freeze in the lungs. The sun was a pale, useless disk in a steel-gray sky. In town, the consequences were piling up like the snowdrifts. Finch's store was running low on everything. He had sold the last of his kerosene 2 weeks ago. Firewood, once a communal resource, was now a commodity to be hoarded and guarded. The price had tripled, and still, there was not enough. People were burning their furniture, their fence posts, anything that would catch a flame. The town doctor, a weary man named Harris, was treating a constant stream of patients with frostbitten fingers and toes, and worse, the deep, rattling cough of lung fever. The livestock were dying. The cold was so profound that it penetrated the thickest barn walls. Ranchers would enter their barns in the morning to find cattle frozen solid in their stalls, standing as if they were still alive. The community, already frayed by hardship, began to turn inward. Suspicion replaced neighborliness. A man who had a large woodpile was looked upon with envy and resentment. The shared struggle was becoming a series of individual, desperate battles for survival. The contrast with Abner's existence was absolute. His life fell into a quiet, monastic rhythm. He would wake, tend his small, efficient fire, eat a simple meal, and spend his days reading or mending his tools. The warmth from the stone floor was a constant, silent companion. It required so little fuel, a few logs every 6 or 7 hours, that his woodpile seemed to shrink at an impossibly slow rate. He was not merely surviving, he was living, and living with a measure of peace the town could not possibly imagine. He would occasionally stand at the entrance of his cave, peering through the narrow opening at the white, windswept world. He saw the smoke rising from the chimneys in redemption, thin, frantic plumes whipped away by the wind. He knew what that smoke represented, a desperate, inefficient battle, with most of the heat escaping uselessly into the frozen sky. They were pouring their lifeblood into their stoves and getting almost nothing in return. The irony was a quiet, somber thing. They pitied him, the lonely old man in the hills. They thought of him, if they thought of him at all, as a ghost, already frozen in his rock-hewn tomb. They had no idea that he was the warmest man in the county. Frank's breaking point came on a Tuesday morning that was 30 degrees below zero. He found 3 of his best breeding cows and a yearling calf frozen solid in the barn. It was a devastating loss, not just of money, but of a future. He had done everything right. He had insulated the walls with sod and straw, he had kept the stove in the corner burning day and night, but the cold had leached through all his defenses. It was a thief, and it had stolen the heart of his herd. In his grief and rage, a strange thought surfaced: Abner. The old man in the cave. It was a fool's errand, a desperate, illogical impulse. But the alternative was to sit in his freezing house and watch his livelihood die around him. He had to do something, even if it was just to confirm the town's grim prophecies about the old widower. He bundled himself in every layer he owned and began the trek to the hills. The wind was a physical force, pushing him back, stealing the air from his lungs. By the time he reached the rock face, his beard was a solid mass of ice. He found the fissure, a dark slit against the snow, and called out, his voice thin and raw. "Abner! Are you in there?" Silence. He called again, louder, his voice cracking with the cold and a sudden, sharp fear that he was shouting into a tomb. Just as he was about to turn away, a shape appeared in the darkness. It was Abner. And he was not what Frank had expected. He was not gaunt or frost-rimed. He was wearing a simple wool shirt, not a heavy coat. His face was calm. Most unnervingly, his breath did not explode in a thick white plume as Frank's did. It was a faint, almost invisible mist. "Frank," Abner said, his voice steady. "What brings you all the way out here?" Frank stared, momentarily speechless. I came to check on you." It is cold," Abner agreed, with a simple nod. "Come inside." He stepped back, holding a heavy wool blanket aside. Frank hesitated, then ducked through the opening, half expecting a blast of frigid, stagnant air. Instead, the air was still. And it was not cold. He stopped, confused, his senses trying to reconcile the howling blizzard outside with the profound quiet within. There was no fire in sight, no flickering light, no smoke. Yet the piercing agony of the cold began to recede from his skin. "How?" he began, looking around the dim chamber. "Where is your fire?" Abner pointed to the floor. "The fire is below." "The warmth is in the stone." Frank knelt, pulling off a glove, and pressed his palm flat against the rock floor. It was warm. A deep, gentle, impossible warmth that seemed to rise from the very heart of the earth. He looked up at Abner, his skepticism warring with the undeniable evidence of his own senses. "I don't understand." Frank's report was met with the exact reception one would expect. He told his story at Finch's store, the only place people still gathered, seeking warmth from the big pot-bellied stove that devoured wood at an alarming rate. He spoke of the calm, the quiet, and the impossible warmth of the stone floor. He described Abner, looking healthier than any man in the room. They listened, and then they dismissed him. "The cold has addled your wits, Frank," Finch declared, his voice carrying the weight of town consensus. "You were seeing things." Another man chimed in, he's probably found himself a hot spring in that cave. Some kind of volcanic vent. It's just dumb luck. That explanation was far more palatable. It required no revision of their opinion of Abner. He wasn't a genius, he was a lucky fool who had stumbled upon a geological anomaly. It preserved the natural order of things, where a man like Finch, a man of commerce and standing, was wise, and a reclusive old rancher was, at best, a fortunate eccentric. The idea of a hot spring became the accepted truth, a convenient narrative that explained away the uncomfortable facts Frank had presented. But the story lingered, a persistent splinter in the town's consciousness. The winter, meanwhile, offered no quarter. The brief period of still cold gave way to another storm, this one laden with ice. A thick, clear sheath coated every surface, making travel treacherous and bringing down branches with the sharp crack of rifle fire. The town's misery deepened. The reserves of food and fuel were critically low. Dr. Harris was now dealing with injuries from falls on the ice on top of everything else. He was out of most medicines, and his face was a permanent mask of exhaustion. The narrative of Abner's luck began to fray at the edges. A few people, the ones who had lost the most, began to wonder. Luck was one thing, but Abner's placid survival felt like something else entirely. It felt like a rebuke. While they were failing, he was somehow enduring. The man they had pitied was becoming an enigma, and for some, a source of resentment. Why should he be warm while their children shivered? The question was unfair, but in the depths of a brutal winter, fairness was a luxury no one could afford. The social fabric of redemption was stretching to its breaking point, pulled taut between communal suffering and the unsettling rumor of one man's inexplicable comfort. The story of the warm cave was no longer just a curiosity, it was becoming a focal point for the town's desperation and envy. The arrival of Mr. Davies was an accident. He was a surveyor for the railroad, a man whose life was governed by angles, measurements, and the unyielding laws of physics. His work had been cut short by the weather, and his attempt to reach the next major settlement had ended in redemption when one of his horses went lame and the ice storm made further travel impossible. He was a man of the outside world, educated and pragmatic, and he carried an air of authority that the locals instinctively respected. He took a room at the town's small boarding house and spent his days reading his manuals and making calculations, a small island of methodical order in a sea of encroaching chaos. It was inevitable that he would hear the story of Abner's cave. He heard it from Finch, who presented it as a piece of local folklore, a testament to a crazy old man's dumb luck. Found himself a hot spring, we reckon, Finch concluded, self-assured. But Davies, a man who had mapped geological formations across the territory, was immediately skeptical. There are no recorded geothermal vents in this region, he stated flatly. The underlying rock is stable granite. It's highly improbable, Finch just shrugged, but Davies's interest was piqued. He sought out Frank, who recounted his experience with a sincerity that Davies found compelling. Frank didn't talk of magic or luck, he spoke of a physical sensation, of a system he could not comprehend. There was no steam, Frank insisted. No smell of sulfur like you get with hot springs. It was just warm and quiet. The discrepancy between the town's explanation and the eyewitness account intrigued the surveyor. This was a puzzle, and Davies loved puzzles. It was a question of thermodynamics, not folklore. He decided he had to see it for himself. "I'm going up there," he announced to Finch the next morning. "I'd like you and Frank to accompany me. I need to see this phenomenon with my own eyes." Finch balked, reluctant to make the treacherous journey for what he still believed was a fool's errand. But Davies's quiet insistence was hard to refuse. Frank, on the other hand, readily agreed, eager for the validation that an educated man might bring. The three men set out under a sky the color of a bruise. The journey was a brutal testament to the winter's power. The wind was a razor, and the ice-coated ground made every step a calculated risk. It was a walk through a world that wanted them dead, and it solidified in Davies's mind the sheer improbability of survival in a simple cave, hot spring or no. By the time they reached the hills, even he was beginning to doubt. How could any man, let alone an old one, withstand this? Their arrival was unceremonious. A call from Frank, a brief wait in the biting wind, and then the blanket was pulled aside and Abner stood before them. He registered no surprise, only a quiet acceptance of their presence. He invited them in with a simple gesture. Davies entered first, his analytical mind already taking notes. The first observation was the air. As Frank had described, it was still and devoid of the piercing cold. His senses, honed by years of outdoor work, immediately registered the profound difference from the environment just inches away, on the other side of the rock wall. He unbuttoned his heavy coat, an act that would have been unthinkable anywhere else. Finch followed, his face a mask of disbelief, his loud skepticism silenced by the undeniable physical reality. He looked around wildly, as if searching for the trick, the hidden fire, the source of the heat. Frank entered last, a look of quiet vindication on his face. Davies ignored the men. He was observing the system. He saw the raised stone floor, noting the precise join sealed with mortar. He saw the lack of any visible fire or smoke. He walked the perimeter of the chamber, his boots making soft sounds on the stone. He knelt down, just as Frank had, and laid his bare hand on the floor. He held it there for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then he began to move with purpose. He walked to the antechamber and saw the small, unassuming furnace, its metal door cool to the touch. He noted its construction, the efficient air intake, the way it was built into the rock. He then returned to the main chamber, his eyes tracing the path from the furnace's location to the floor, and then up the far wall to the ceiling. He saw nothing, but he was a man accustomed to seeing the invisible logic behind a structure. He turned to Abner, his voice full of a new respect. "The flue," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. "It runs beneath the floor." Abner simply nodded. "The thermal mass," Davies continued, his mind racing, connecting the pieces. "You're not just heating the air. You're heating the rock. You've built a storage battery for heat. The stone absorbs it slowly and radiates it slowly." My God, he stood up and looked at Finch, whose jaw was slack with astonishment. "This isn't a hot spring. This isn't luck." He gestured around the quiet, warm space. "This is engineering. Brilliant, brutally efficient engineering. He's using a fraction of the fuel you're using in town, and he's achieving a perfectly stable temperature. He's turned the entire cave into a radiator." In the profound quiet of the cavern, the surveyor's words landed with the force of a physical blow. The truth was revealed, not as magic, but as something far more potent, human ingenuity. The story Davies told upon his return to redemption was not a rumor, it was a testimony. He explained the principles of thermal mass, of radiant heat, of slow combustion and flue design, using simple, clear language that everyone could understand. He dismantled the myth of the hot spring and replaced it with the fact of Abner's genius. The town's perception of the old man shifted overnight, a seismic reordering of their social landscape. The pity and scorn they had felt for him curdled into a deep, resounding shame, which was quickly replaced by awe. He was not the town fool, he was the town's unacknowledged prophet. The change was immediate. People no longer spoke of Abner in whispers, they spoke his name with a reverence previously reserved for founders and legends. And then, they started to walk. Not all at once, but in small, humble groups. They made the pilgrimage to the hills, not as a posse of doubters, but as students seeking a master. They came with questions. They brought offerings of tobacco and coffee, peace offerings for their past ignorance. Abner, a man unaccustomed to company, received them with his usual quiet dignity. He was not a natural teacher, but he was a patient demonstrator. He did not give lectures on thermodynamics, he took them into the cave and let them feel the warm floor. He showed them the construction of the flue, the way the stones were laid, the composition of the mortar he had mixed. He answered their plain-spoken questions with plain-spoken answers. "Could a man build something like this in a root cellar?" one farmer asked, his eyes wide with possibility. Abner considered it. "The principle is the same," he said. "The earth holds the warmth, if you give it a reason." To that single idea ignited a revolution. The following spring, the sound of construction echoed through redemption. But it wasn't the sound of new cabins being raised, it was the sound of cellars being dug, of stone being laid. People began retrofitting their homes, building smaller, more efficient stoves and routing the flues under stone-lined floors before they exited through the chimney. They learned to build with the land, not just upon it. They incorporated the immense thermal battery of the earth into their homes. The change was not immediate, but over the next few winters, the results became undeniable. The frantic, wasteful consumption of firewood lessened. The homes were not just warmer, they were a different kind of warm, a steady, bone-deep comfort that lasted through the night. The winter death toll, a grim annual accounting of the vulnerable, dropped precipitously. Abner's quiet winter project had become the town's blueprint for survival. He had not sought to lead or to teach, only to endure. But in solving his own problem, he had provided the answer for them all. Years passed. The Great Winter of '88 became a benchmark in the town's history, a story told to newcomers to explain the unique construction of their houses, with their warm floors and their curious, meandering chimneys. The hardships of that year were a foundational myth, but the memory of the suffering was now tempered by the legacy of the solution. Redemption had been aptly named, after all. It had found its salvation not in a sudden miracle, but in a slow, learned wisdom. Abner was long gone. He had lived out his years quietly, never seeking credit or praise for the transformation he had set in motion. He remained a man of few words and solitary habits, respected and left in peace, which was all he had ever wanted. After his passing, his cave in the hills became a kind of landmark, a place young people would visit, touching the stones of the floor and trying to imagine the profound cold outside and the radical warmth within. The system he built eventually fell into disuse, the mortar crumbling, the flue slowly filling with dirt and debris. It returned to being just a cave. But the idea it had sheltered was now alive and well, built into the very bones of the town he had saved. We see redemption in another winter, decades later. It is just as cold, the snow just as deep, the wind just as sharp. But the town is different. It is secure. Lights glow from the windows of well-built homes. Inside one such home, a family gathers. A mother reads to her children, who are sprawled comfortably not near a roaring stove, but on the gently heated stone of the hearth, which extends across much of the floor. The warmth is constant, a silent guardian against the night. The lessons of that terrible winter had been learned, absorbed, and passed down. They were no longer a radical innovation but a simple matter of common sense. The solution had never been about a bigger fire or a thicker wall. It had been about understanding the quiet, patient power of the earth itself. The final images of the hills, silent under a blanket of snow and a sky full of cold, distant stars. The fissure leading to Abner's cave is almost invisible, a slight shadow on the face of the rock. The wind moves over the granite, finding no purchase, its howl a testament to the power Abner had refused to fight. He had not conquered the stone, nor had he battled the fire. He had simply introduced them to each other, and in that quiet introduction, he had taught the rock how to hold the flame.